This is a 1991 Mitsubishi Galant VR-4, and it's cool. Long before we ever got the Mitsubishi Lancer Evolution here in the United States, we had this with a similar formula. Turbocharged, all-wheel drive, four-cylinder, manual transmission, four-wheel steering in a sedan body style with excellent performance for its day. These are very obscure, but today I'm going to review the Galant VR-4 and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news! This Mitsubishi Galant VR-4 is currently for sale, and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. And it's owned by a personal friend of mine and a Cars and Bids employee. It's fantastic, and you should buy it. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this Galant VR-4, where you can bid on and buy this tremendously rare piece of Mitsubishi history, only on Cars and Bids. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Galant VR-4 with a little overview of exactly what this car is, because like I said, it's pretty obscure. So here's the deal. The Mitsubishi Lancer Evolution, a car that all enthusiasts know and most of them love, kind of traces its roots back to the Galant VR-4. In fact, a lot of people call this the Prevo, the pre-Evo, because that's pretty much what it was. Just like the Lancer Evolution, the Galant VR-4 is the road version of a Mitsubishi rally car. The Galant rally car competed in Group A rally racing in the early 1990s, and in order to compete, rules said that Mitsubishi had to build 5,000 actual road versions of the car, and then they could go rallying, and so the Galant VR-4 was born. The result was Mitsubishi did indeed make 5,000 of these, primarily sold in North America and in Asia. Here in North America, there were two model years. Mitsubishi sold 2,000 for the 1991 model year, and then another batch of 1,000 for the 92 model year, and the rest were sold in Asia. But here in North America, they weren't easy sells. This was a high-performance version of Mitsubishi's mid-size Galant sedan, and buyers just didn't get it. It was kind of expensive, and there weren't performance versions of the Accord or the Camry. This car just didn't really take off. And as a result, when Mitsubishi decided to switch its rally car operations from the mid-size Galant to the smaller Lancer, they figured American buyers were no longer interested in the performance version of that car. Once the Galant VR-4 went away, the Lancer Evolution came out, but not in America. And it would be over a decade before the Evo and the high-performance Mitsubishi rally car for the road returned to the United States after this car. But the Galant VR-4 shared more with the Lancer Evolution than just its ethos as the road-going version of a rally-bred performance sedan. In fact, the two cars also shared powertrains. The Galant VR-4 uses Mitsubishi's famous 4G63 turbocharged four-cylinder, which also powered the Lancer Evolution for many, many years of the Evo's original lifespan. But here in North America, the 4G63 is more famous because it was the powertrain in the DSM cars, the Diamond Star Motors vehicles. That would be the Mitsubishi Eclipse, the Eagle Talon, and the Plymouth Laser. The high-performance versions of those cars used this same turbo 4G63 engine, mated to all-wheel drive and a manual transmission, just like the Galant VR-4. And throughout the 90s, this powertrain was famous in the tuner community for people who are trying to get big power from their Mitsubishi Eclipse or their Eagle Talon. The engine was used here too. In fact, aside from the obvious difference in body style, the Galant VR-4 is a sedan and those DSM cars were coupe hatchbacks, the only real difference was where they were built. The DSM cars were all made in the same factory in Illinois. The Galant VR-4 was built in Japan, but otherwise they were largely the same underneath. But anyway, speaking of the 4G63, let's talk power. In this car, it made about 200 horsepower. It was only mated to a manual transmission and all-wheel drive. That's the only way these came, and about 200 horses. The result was 0 to 60 in the low 7-second range, which isn't amazing by modern standards at all, but it was only about a second off the 0 to 60 time of the BMW M5 when this car was new. And you got to keep in mind, back then the Ferrari 348, the fun, fast, mid-engine Ferrari, was doing 0 to 60 in like the mid to high 4-second range. So performance standards were a little different then, and this was considered a fairly serious performance car. Now, one other cool feature the Galant VR-4 had, which the Evo and the DSM cars didn't, is four-wheel steering, which Mitsubishi proudly proclaimed on this decal in the back window. These cars had four-wheel steering, and it would activate at higher speeds to help you through corners, take turns a little bit faster, make this car even more of a credible high-performance sedan. But anyway, next up, let's move on to the interesting quirks and features in this car, and there are surprisingly many of them. I'm going to start with the dash plaque, which you can see here. These were individually numbered. This is 1114 out of 2000 in the original 1991 production run. Now, like I said, they made another 1,000 units for 92, so they probably had their own dash plaques, but this car has its cool plaque to signify that it's special. Now, my very favorite quirk of the Galant VR-4 is in the gauge cluster. There's a little button in the lower left corner that's marked change color. And if you're driving at night with the lights on, the dash lights are on, you press that button and the gauge cluster light changes color, as you can see here. It's like a very, very early version of the color changing interior mood lighting that so many cars offer now. What an interesting and early adoption of this idea. Now, also interesting in the gauge cluster, you can see there are two separate trip odometers. You have trip A, which is 3 digits and a tenth, and then trip B, which is 4 digits. So you can have like a shorter trip odometer and a longer one, and you can reset them with this single stick down here. You push in to reset trip A, and you twist to the right to reset trip B, and it's just very interesting to see dueling trip odometers. Also interesting in the gauge cluster, you have a turbo boost gauge, which isn't that uncommon. Turbo cars from this era often had one, but here it's electronic. You can see as the turbo spools up, little electronic lights light up in the turbo boost gauge to show you where you are with your turbo boost, and that's cool and a lot more exciting than just a standard boring dial. And there's more quirks beyond just the gauge cluster. In the center control stack, you have your climate controls, which have some oddities. For example, you can turn on air conditioning by pushing this button with a snowflake, or you can push it again and then it lights up in a different color. So I guess you push to turn it on and then you push it to turn it on more. Really though, I think one of those is like an eco mode for the air conditioning, but it's interesting to see the same button having those two functions. More unusual in the climate controls though, is that you can switch where the air blows from left to right. This switch here actually lets you pick. If you want more airflow on the left side, you move it over to L, and then all of the air comes out the driver's side vent and the left vent in the center. If you want it on the right side, switch it over to R, and then all of the climate control air comes out there. Now in most cars, if you want to turn off a side of the climate control air, you just close the vents. And you can do that here too, little switches that let you close up the vents that you want to close, but it's easier to just switch the dial left to right. It's actually a pretty cool idea, and it's here in the Galant VR-4. Now, also interesting, in the center control stack, you have the factory tape player here. You don't often see that. These older cars often have it replaced with a different head unit, but there it is, and it includes the loud button, which I love. You can press that and things get louder. Of course, you could also turn up the volume, but isn't it cooler to just press the loud button? Other interesting quirks in here, for one, the cruise control is at the end of the windshield wiper stalk. So this is the wiper stalk, you can push it up or down, and that turns on the wipers, but you can twist the end to turn on the cruise control. So that's a multi-function stalk. Kind of interesting to see it there before cruise controls went onto the steering wheel. Now, also interesting with this stalk, the intermittent wipers in this car aren't just regular intermittent. In most cars in this area, you turn them on, dial up like a time of intermittent and they would do that. But here, it's speed sensitive. So if you have it on the lowest intermittent setting and you're going slowly, they'll go one speed, but as you pick up your speed, Mitsubishi figures more water comes onto your windshield, so the wipers actually pick up their pace and the time in between wipes decreases. This is explained here in the owner's manual. As you can see, intermittent wipers, but speed sensitive ones, which is very interesting. Never seen that before, and it wasn't too long after this that car companies started to figure out automatic wiper sensors. They didn't really need this, but it was a strange, quirky idea. Now, next up, another interesting quirk in this car. You look around this interior and you won't find any cup holders, which was pretty standard for cars made in the early 90s. But if you lift up the center console lid, there they are. There are your cup holders. And if you lift up the cup holders, you will find a center console storage area beneath them. So it was kind of an interesting way to add cup holders without redesigning anything. Now, also here in the center console of this car, you have your manual transmission. This is a 5-speed manual, which was pretty common back in the day. And at the base of the gear lever, you have this rubbery accordion look, which was also pretty common back in the day. It is such a 90s look, but a lot of cars did it back then, and it's kind of interesting to see. And speaking of 90s relics in this car, we got to talk about the seat belts, these famous 90s electronic seat belts. You would open the door and then they would move on a track forward so that you could climb inside. Then once you were inside, you would buckle your lap seat belt, and when you closed the door, these electronic belts would move back into position and function as a 3-point belt. You just had 2 separate belts, the lap one, which you belted, and then the electronic one, which did it itself. This was a common function in a lot of 90s cars. I believe the government regulation at the time was automakers could either put airbags in their cars or these seat belts. They had to choose, and the belts were a lot cheaper, so less expensive cars had these horrible electronic seat belts that went down a track every time you got in and out of your car. And next up, another interesting 90s detail in this car, the driver's side window panel. The driver's window is auto down, but the way it works is very early 90s. You would press the window switch and it would hold itself in place as the window went down. When the window finished going down, then the window switch would release, almost as if you were holding it there, but instead the car was holding it there, so you didn't have to. An early example of an auto down window. With that said, speaking of the door panel, one interesting thing I don't really associate with early 90s Japanese cars is this nice piece of suede on the door panel. You can see it here. And over on the passenger side, you have an even larger piece of suede. It feels very classy and luxurious. Again, not exactly what I'd expect from cars from this era. But anyway, next up we move on to the backseat of the Galant VR-4, where there's not that much interesting going on. Probably the most unusual thing back here is the weird cubbies inside the seats for the belt buckles. You can see them here. I've seen like little cutouts for belt buckles, but never cubbies that you can stick them into and then they live inside the seat. Although I guess it's a cool idea to keep them from getting lost underneath the backrest, which could sometimes happen. Other than that, the back seat of this car, not really that much interesting. You do have the same suede panel on the rear doors that you had up front, which is a nice luxury touch. And of course, it's not exactly huge back here, although it's not really that small either. Like I said, the Galant was Mitsubishi's mid-size sedan in the early 90s, a competitor to the Toyota Camry, the Honda Accord, so it was intended to be a family car, at least in regular non-VR4 forms. There's decent room back here, not huge, but not too bad. And next up, also interesting, on the outside of this car, the wheels. I absolutely love the wheels. No, not the 15-inch wheels or this wheel design, but I love the fact that they are body colored. It might be hard for you to see, but this car is green and the wheels are painted green to match, and that was something that they offered from the factory on the Galant VR-4. Now, you could also get regular silver wheels like most cars have, but my very favorite color combination was a white car with white matching wheels. It just looked so early 90s rally car cool, and I've always felt that was the best Galant VR-4. But green with green wheels is pretty cool too, and it makes this car feel more special. Now, another upgrade to the exterior of the Galant VR-4 was a body kit around the lower edges. It doesn't look substantial or too sporty or exciting, but it was there to help distinguish this car a little bit from the standard Galant. It added fog lights, just a little bit more trim to make it seem cooler. The body kit and the Galant VR-4 also came with a trunk spoiler, as you can see, which again helped emphasize the performance potential of the Galant VR-4. All right, driving the Galant VR-4, world famous, or at least famous in my world. I have always wanted to review one of these. They are tremendously hard to find. Like I said, only 3,000 sold in the United States, but that doesn't tell the whole story. All of these cars with the 4G63s were heavily modified, abused, not the most reliable cars also, frankly. And a lot of these are dead, and I don't even remember the last time I saw a Galant VR-4. Certainly randomly, it's been probably 5-10 years. And even at events, they're really, really uncommon, and often when they are there, they're modded, and you know, this car is pretty much totally stock, and it's unbelievable for me to experience this. I've liked this car since I was a kid. Now, before I get into the driving experience, I want to tell you the story about this car. The original owner of this car was a little old lady, although she wasn't old when she bought it. She had the car 30 years, probably 50. When she got it, and she kept it for many, many years. She wanted a green one and found one new at a dealership back in 1991, bought it, and kept it all this time. And apparently, when she bought this car, her husband at the same time bought a 3000 GT VR-4, which was later stolen. So she was like, well, I want to keep the Galant forever. And so she did. So let's talk driving experience. It's surprisingly spry. Not necessarily in terms of acceleration, I'll get to that in a minute, but in terms of like its size. You know, this car was rejected, I think, a little bit at the time that it came out because it was a mid-size sedan. 200 horsepower and a mid-size sedan, it wasn't that fast, right? And it also just didn't have, like, the Impreza was a size class smaller. The WRXs weren't sold here, but it was. And the Mazda 323 GTX was smaller, and this was sort of a mid-size. It was too big at the time. But now, you look at this car and you're like, this is kind of perfect size. It's about the size of a compact car today, and so it has kind of that punchy compact car feel. Now, let's talk about acceleration. The 4G63 powertrain. I've now reviewed several cars with this engine, and it was a great engine when it was working, but it was especially a great engine in the period. 200 horsepower in an Eclipse GSX. That was big. In this car, it's a little less big. 0 to 60 was in the low 7s, and honestly, by modern standards, this car just doesn't really feel all that fast. It's charming, it's cool, but it's not what I would call fast by today's standards, today's vehicles. Now, with that said, I still find it to be charming. And I was talking to the owner of this car, and I think we hit on like a really important point, which is none of these cars feel fast today. Like no 90s car, even Ferraris, are not like fast today. They're more about like the experience, the nostalgia, the vintage feel. And I think that's the cool thing about this car. People are gonna watch this video and be like, a 4G63 that's not modded, how stupid, you gotta do a couple things to it. I think that the general feeling is coming the other direction. People want these cars now not modified. They want to use them like they used them when they were kids. The nostalgia factor is there, and these cars feel like nostalgic and cool old school vehicles. And this certainly has that feel to me. And so yeah, this car is not particularly fast, but like sitting in here and looking around this interior and feeling it and seeing it and smelling it, like it feels like my childhood. This car feels so much like my childhood. And I think that that's one of the coolest things about it. And actually, in terms of driving experience, like, yeah, it doesn't feel amazingly fast, but it does feel like fun to drive. Like I said earlier, it's little and it feels kind of tossable. And I think that that's great. But also, like, the shift action is surprisingly fantastic. The clutch is nice and easy to operate. The gear lever is especially nice and easy to operate. And like, it's just like an easy, fun car to drive. And you get in this car and you're not doing that much work, but you're feeling this nostalgia of the old days. And I think that that's like the coolest thing about this car and the coolest thing about a lot of cars from this era. Again, not tremendously performance-y, but like you feel the feel of what it was like. Overall, I think this is a cool car. It's not cool in the sense that like a new Model 3 Performance is, where it's fast and full of tech. It's the exact opposite. It's cool because it's like old school and fun. It's not that fast. It's a different era, and I think that that's like one of the coolest things about vehicles like this, especially stock. They really bring you back to a different time, and this does that for me. And it's fun to be able to drive this car and enjoy an original Galant VR-4
which truly I've wanted to spend time in for a long time now.
And so that's the 1991 Mitsubishi Galant VR-4. This is a special car, and I've always lusted after it, but I've never been able to review one. So I'm thrilled that I finally had the chance to check out a nice one. And now it's time to give the Galant VR-4 a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 44 out of 100, which puts the Galant VR-4 here against some sort of similar cars. There's a lot to like about the Galant VR-4, including all-wheel drive, a manual transmission, and reasonably strong acceleration and good handling. But it also suffers from a late 1980s, early 90s interior that hasn't aged well, with an abundance of cheap plastic and the fact that part supply is dwindling. Still, I like this car a lot, and finding a stock one to review was a huge win. This was an icon of my childhood, and I'm thrilled I got to spend time with it.